insurance policy was written in Posey, New Jersey. In 1935, the compulsory driving test and license plates were introduced in the United Kingdom. In 1962, SS officer Adolf Eichmann was executed in Israel after being found guilty of war crimes. In 1975, cars in the Netherlands were required to have seat belts. In 2007, Jack Kevorkian was released from prison after serving 8 years of his 10 to 25 prison term for a 1998 second-degree murder. And in 2017, U.S. President Donald Trump announced that the U.S. was withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement. Now for birthdays, American religious leader Brigham Young, American Grammy Award winner Nelson Riddle, American actress Joan Caulfield, American actor Andy Griffin, God knows we all remember him, American actress Marilyn Monroe, American singer Pat Boone, and American actor Morgan Freeman. Now it's my pleasure to turn this mic over to most competent, most wonderful co-chair Mark Cooper. Give him a hand.
I don't know what you all think, but I also remember Marilyn Monroe pretty well. Our speaker today is no stranger to this podium. Maggie Winter, a fellow member of our club, studied at William Patterson University, where she earned a bachelor's degree in special education with a minor in elementary education. I feel comfortable with that because my wife did the very same thing at a different school. Subsequently, she went on to complete her master's at Long Island University, master's in special education with a focus on learning disabilities and emotional disturbances. My wife did that too. Maggie worked in the special education field for 42 years, including clinical experience at the Yale Child Study Center. Her work was in elementary, middle school, and in high school. Because Maggie is primarily of Irish descent, it became important to her to acquire knowledge about Ireland's history and its impact on her ancestors. Like most Americans, her ancestors left the land that they loved, and she had a need to understand the forces behind these decisions. Currently, Maggie is the chair of our genealogy interest group at University Club, and if you've never gone to that, you really need to, because it's fascinating. She's a member of the Central Florida Genealogical Society and has served on their board in the past. Her presentation today is entitled The 1998 Good Friday Agreement, a fragile but lasting peace based on the principle of consent, which I know will be fascinating. So let's greet our speaker, Maggie Winter.
Okay, well today I'm going to be talking about the Good Friday Agreement. It was signed in can you hear me? Good? Okay, 1998, and it's still a work in progress. Basically, the Northern Ireland Assembly today was created by this 1998 agreement. Before that, it was a parliament that was really a Protestant parliament. There were hardly any Catholics in the parliament before then. So this assembly today has managed to bridge the abyss of hate that reached its peak in the 1970s. And the assembly was a major component of the Good Friday Agreement. And the current citizens are mostly optimistic and a bit amazed by how this has been working. However, it's been a rocky road. So I'm going to be going over the historical factors that led up to the year of the Troubles, which are, it's a long period, 800. I'm going to go through the first several slides very quickly. Most of the topics could be a topic all by themselves. Some have been presented here before at a history group. And if you have questions about these little episodes during that 800 parties on all sides, and there were many failed attempts to end violence. And the peace agreement process really started long before it actually came to fruition in 1998, and even that didn't solve everything at that moment in time. And the status of the peace agreement today. And I'm sure we'll get to discussing some parallels and conflicts today and throughout history. We seem to, I don't know that history repeats itself, but we don't seem to learn from our mistakes. So if you go back to the Vikings, believe it or not, this is all was pretty good in Ireland to some extent when the Vikings were there. They assimilated into the Irish culture very well. They were there for quite a while and married into it, created the cities of Dublin and Limerick, and all was pretty good as far as the average citizen was concerned. The royals at the time, Brian Boru and his side, decided to go to war with the Vikings and kick them out of town, basically, in 1114. And that was really the beginning of the fragile nature of Ireland. There was King Henry II, and he was very anxious about the situation in Ireland as he looked at their relationship with the French, quite an enemy of England at the time. And he thought they were having too much influence. So he managed to convince Pope Adrian that the Catholics were going to, well, hell in a handbasket, basically, because the Vikings had corrupted them. This was all a fabrication. It wasn't really the true deal. I would say Irish Catholics at that time had a kind of unique form of Christianity. It was Catholic, but they mixed their pagan beliefs in with it a little bit, and they still believed in the Banshee coming and that kind of stuff. So, but they weren't going to hell in a handbasket. They were a very Catholic nation at that point in time. Not a nation, society. So he manages to convince them that they're going to hell in a handbasket, and he gets Pope Adrian to issue a papal bull, which is called the Laudabilter in 51 rather. And he basically, this papal bull gives England the authority to go in there and straighten them out and get them back on the right path religiously. So this was the beginning of 800 years of subjugation to British rule. So it starts to get a little bad in 1367 when King Henry III now decides that he's going to write the Statutes of Kilkenny. And he's very worried at this point, this particular king is worried about the Old English, mainly from Scotland, some from England, some from Wales, who were becoming more Irish than the Irish, that they had settled in Ireland and were, just kind of absorbing all their ways, their culture, their dancing, everything that they did, and their political leanings. So he decides to get Parliament, which is basically Protestant merchants at this point in time, the Old English, to okay these Statutes of Kilkenny. Now they were kind of like they were impossible to enforce. So he's telling them you can't speak the Irish language, you can't perform Irish music and dance, you can't pursue Irish pastimes, you can't conduct Irish commerce, and you can't appoint Irish clergy, and you can't appoint Irish judges. Well, most of this he's making these edicts, but it's not really working out very well. There are laws on the books, and things are happening, but it's very hard for them to enforce it. But then later on, in the 15th and 18th century, you get the penal laws. This is the Reformation. King Henry VIII is rising on the throne now. It's always the Henrys. Okay, so King Henry VIII gets the Irish Parliament to pass a thing called the Crown Act during this time, and also he's becoming very concerned about the way the Irish Catholics are possibly related to France still, so France is a problem, and interfering with English ways. And so the penal laws basically were kind of meant to put the Irish in their place and make them almost subhuman. The feeling with the British Crown at this point in time, by the time we get to this era, is that the Irish are a worthless bunch and we're not going to let them have any rights whatsoever. And these penal laws were also hard to enforce, had a lot of backlash. A penal law would be passed and then it would be repealed or ignored and another one would come along the way. So there are actually pages and pages and pages of these laws if you go to the library and look this up. But the Catholics were forbidden to receive an education at times, to enter any professions, to hold public office, to live in a town, to pass anything down to their children. Basically, they weren't allowed to own a horse that was worth anything. They weren't allowed to learn how to read and write. If you were teaching them how to read and write at different points during these penal laws, it was an act of treason. So basically, they were subjects of England, not citizens. Basically, just under the thumb of England. So, as I said, many of these laws had a short existence, and there was some industry in the north, but basically it's an agrarian society. So the Crown Act comes along with Henry VIII, and he got the Irish Parliament, which, as I said, was predominantly Old English, to pass this law, and this is because the Old English basically wanted to cement their relationship with Britain. Now that Britain was a Protestant country, they wanted to shore that up. So this is the first time that religion is really coming into the picture as a big problem. Back with the Watervelter in 1151, or basically, later than that, but in that era, when the Pope declared that England could go in there and control things, there was really no issue of language or religion. It was really a land grab and a power trip kind of a situation. And that's still really the case. The Old English wanted to cement their relationship, and through all of this, Rome does not recognize that what the king has done. It says that you have no right to do that, basically. They're still under the control of the Pope, and kind of basically ignored what's going on there. So the next area you have is the Jacobean area, and I think this has been covered in previous talks quite a bit. But he happened to be the king that started what's called the Irish plantations. Now these are not really plantations like we think of today as a plantation in the United States. This was an act of bringing my pointer to work. His idea was that I'm going to get this area is, whoops, this area here, everything in tan is Protestant at the time when he starts these plantations. He's going to start bringing Protestants from all over the world, basically. This is the Reformation, and you've got people trying to escape religious persecution, and he's going to plant these Protestants here and kind of drive out the Catholics or make them more of a Catholic area. So an important county to note here is Monaghan, because at this point in time it's already Protestant, or majority Protestant, so James doesn't think he needs to do anything about them. Okay? So. And then along comes the War of Charles. We know he didn't have too good of an existence. That's been covered here in History Group. Loses his head eventually. And the war, he's at war with three kingdoms, basically Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, and he's having a lot of trouble. And the question in Ireland at that time is, should the British um, hold power and land, and should Ireland be self-governing under Charles, and should Ireland be subordinate to the English Parliament? Of course, none of these things really got solved at that point. And then along comes Oliver Cromwell, one of our favorites. I'm being sarcastic. He basically made life miserable for everybody. Pretty much that's the universal point of view. He hates Catholics, but he also objects to the Protestant sects that had invaded Ireland during the plantation system. He's a Puritan. He's not keen on anybody there, and he just wrecks havoc there. And he becomes involved in the Confederate Wars, and he makes things worse. The Confederate Wars were wars the Irish were trying to still get some more rights. And so Cromwell makes life miserable for everyone, and Protestants are abused, but they have fewer constraints than the Catholics in the end of it all. And in the next 200 years, the Protestants move into most positions of power. And what's basically happening in this area is any Catholics that can leave do, and many Protestants leave too. The Scots-Irish that we hear about in the United States basically came from this region in Northern Ireland. And mind you, Cromwell's also making a mess of the rest of Ireland. We're always doing this, but we're mostly talking about Northern Ireland today. So the merchant class is small but wealthy, and the general population is poor and uneducated because of the penal laws. And the British disdain everything about their Irish subjects, and anybody able to leave is going out, leaving town. So, going to skip a little bit, a couple hundred years here, and move to the Corn Laws, which were discussed beautifully in January. If you were here for the famine lecture, that was really fascinating. But the Corn Laws are not really, corn is not corn as we think of it, it's any grain. And the potato is a nutritious product. Basically, the Irish were, at that point in time, compared to other races in Europe, were taller and stronger and healthier and living longer because they were eating potatoes instead of some of the other things. It was a pretty healthy diet. It was potatoes and buttermilk. Very exciting day after day, but that's what they were eating. And at this point, Ireland is considered to be the breadbasket for Europe. So you're wondering why in the potato famine did everybody go hungry? They were producing most of the wheat that was consumed by the British. The British felt the blight in 1845 was being exaggerated by the Irish, and attempts at relief did not begin until 1846. And Robert Peel in Parliament in England is working to get the Corn Laws repealed, and he managed to do that, but then he lost his minister's spot, his seat in Parliament because of that passing of the Corn Laws. It was a very difficult time politically. Every bit of grain that was produced in Ireland was being shipped elsewhere because there were tariffs. And the result was that the Irish farmers, small little plots of land, did not have anything to eat. And basically, the English's attitude was, well, just go get a job, kind of like, and any relief that was coming in from the rest of the world was being held in warehouses, and the Irish could have them if they paid for them, and things like that. And so people were selling all their clothes, and everybody's walking around in rags looking like skeletons, and that was pretty much covered. Basically, historians pretty much agree that this was a bit mismanaged at the time by the British. So this is really a thorn in the side still today, I would say, with many Irishmen. The weight of historical grievances is quite heavy. This cartoon was published in 1890. It's 45 years after the famine. And it gives you a picture where you've got the Grim Reaper in the side, and you've got family out on the lawn, and the landlord just not even being concerned, and they're all being evicted. And So that was in 1890, so that's historical grievance that's been carrying on for 45 years. And it's not terribly long ago. And the Fields of Athenry, which you may know as that song, was composed by Pete St. John in 1979, and that's about the Lord Trevelyan's response to the famine. He really was brutal. And it tells the story of a man exiled to Australia and his children are starving. This is a ballad that you can go into any pub, a singing pub in Ireland today, and they'll be singing it. You'll hear it while you're there. Okay, and the next thorn in people's sides is the 1916 Easter Rising, which could be a topic all by itself that I don't recall it being covered here. But the British handling of this was not too good either. This is a photo that you can see in Dublin at the National Museum of Ireland. In the center of the photo is James Connolly on a stretcher. Whoops, sorry. Keep it a minute. In the center of the stretcher is James Connolly, and he is on death's door at this point. There were, what did I do? Okay, there it goes. You're not seeing what I'm seeing, but anyway, James Connolly is close to death, along with, he's the brigadier commander of the Easter Rising. All 10 of them get sentenced to death by firing squad. James Connolly is in such bad shape that he needs to be put on a chair in order to be subjected to the firing squad. And this creates quite a riot with the Irish in the United States, and really everywhere, because they were now in Australia, they were in the United States, and basically England at this point in time is trying to get the United States into World War I, and this becomes a problem for them. They're starting to lose the battle in the court of world opinion. So, while the Easter Rising didn't work, there was another revolution, basically. It could just continue. They didn't really make it go away. There were terrorists wanting freedom from Britain, is basically what they wanted. And this is the records house in Dublin that is being blown up during the battle. And basically, it's a civil war. It erupted on June 2022. There was an anti-treating group because in December of 1921, they had kind of forced a peace agreement on them where they were going to divide Ireland into two countries. This is when the idea of Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland comes into play. And unfortunately, the terms of the treaty were not really too well accepted by the people in Northern Ireland, or the Republic for that matter. So the Civil War erupts in 2022, and they lose, basically. So this is the new map, and you'll notice that County Monaghan is not included in Northern Ireland. That was one of the original parts of the plantation. And also Donegal is not included. These were deemed too Catholic at this point, and Monaghan had been a Protestant county. Too Catholic to be under British rule, and so Northern Ireland is just these 6 counties at this point in time. And the new map did not assuage historical grievances. Things just really got worse. And I would say that this is the birth of the IRA, as we know it sort of today, although it's splintered a couple times. I'll be talking about that. And also Cavan, I forgot to say, right here had been part of the plantations and is not in Northern Ireland, again because it was too Catholic. On here. So this treaty created a situation where you had border checks on every road around the Northern Ireland province, which the say Northern Ireland. Well, in 1923, this wasn't too bad. There weren't too many cars. But this after a while, got a little out of hand, these border checks. In 1993, with the European Economic Community, the border was open. And basically, we were visiting Ireland shortly after that, and people were very happy that this was open. You could now do commerce. In the old situation, you had relatives living on one side of the border and the other, and now you could freely see them. So, however, there were, besides the border checks, there were other problems that arose. Who's going to have sovereignty? Who's going to be in charge? Who's going to have civil and cultural rights? Who's going to decommission all these weapons that have been around? How are we going to demilitarize this situation? Who's going to be in charge of the courts, the justice system? It's kind of a mess. And policing. Who's going to be able to be on the police force and enforce our laws? So, as I said before, these jobs were basically controlled by Protestants, and that's how, in 1923, that's how it came down. Catholics were excluded from shipbuilding industry, which is a very prominent industry in Northern Ireland, and from most civil jobs. And many Catholics left the country in search of work. And the original IRA did not wane until the 1960s. And at that point in time, they waned because they were just kind of exhausted and they weren't getting anywhere. That was the original IRA. And they began to put down their weapons, and their children were beginning to say, this is not the best way to be handling this. They were reading about what was going on in the United States with Martin Luther King. They were in marches where they were singing, "We Shall Overcome," and they were trying to do a peaceful thing. Well, that kind of fell apart. Laws, while the Protestants were in charge after 1923, were passed. The Flags and Emblems Act, it outlawed the display of the Irish tricolored flag. The Special Powers Act was a real big problem. The government could ban meetings and certain types of speech and could search and arrest people without warrants and imprison them indefinitely without a trial. This is something that really hit its full force during the era that we call the Troubles, which is rapidly looming. The Royal Ulster Constabulary recruited volunteers for an armed auxiliary known as the B Specials, who would create these in-depth interrogations. And the city of Belfast Catholic stronghold at this point is Falls Road, and the Protestant stronghold is Shankill Road, and the city is basically divided, and I'd say that Belfast is the hotbed of the Troubles, although it's happening all over Northern Ireland. As I said, the original IRA is saying, at the same time that their children are saying, let's do peaceful demonstrations, they put down their weapons a little bit, some of them, not all of them, and they are basically, everybody's starting to get really disillusioned and things are looking a little shaky. And then there's the Burntoller Bridge ambush. These peaceful marchers, young people, are marching to singing "We Shall Overcome" and things like that, and they are ambushed by loyalists that were known as the Apprentice Boys. Loyalists meaning loyalists to the British Crown. They kind of had the attitude that if we get rid of these Catholics and get them to move away, everything will be fine. And so the Royal Ulster Constabulary was largely Protestant and did not stop the ambush. They just kind of stood on the side of the road and watched it. And then they began to arrest the Catholics that had been fighting back. You can imagine this didn't go well in the minds of the Irish. And pretty soon we got to a situation where the violence now became the only solution in their minds. These young people gave up on these peaceful marches. It didn't work well. And there's a new IRA formed. It's called that the Irish call Derry. And there was just violence everywhere. It was terrible. The Battle of Bogside is another critical thing that happened around the same time. Again, it's the apprentice boys. They began throwing rocks in the Catholic ghetto, and the ghetto is known as Bogside, and the Catholics began to fight back, of course, and then homes were gutted and torched, and the Royal Ulster Constabulary was primarily made up of Protestants, and they really only arrested the Catholics. They weren't arresting too many Protestants. And a British Army military guy, Frank Kitson, is brought in to be the British Brigade in Belfast, where this is going on, to calm things down. Well, he really didn't help. He had the B specials, which I mentioned before, and they did interrogation in depth. And this interrogation in depth was really torture. And in 1978, the European Court of Human Rights held that what Kitson was doing was abominable, but it wasn't inhumane. It was inhumane and abominable, but it was okay. It was okay. So, Kitson had supposedly gone there to neutralize things, and he just was like gasoline on a fire. So, Say Nothing is a book that a good dear friend of mine gave me. She's sitting here in the audience. And it's about this era. I'll show it to you later because there's so much to cover. But the Protestant Catholic paramilitaries in this time now are more fearful of one another than they are almost of the other side. They are, everyone is silent. Many parents knew their kids were out killing people, disappearing people, and they just didn't say anything to their kids because they didn't want to have to report on them. So Say Nothing became quite the common phrase to hear, and Seamus Henry even wrote a poem about it, Say Nothing. It was just the law of the land, say nothing. And during this time, being labeled a tout was about the worst thing that could happen, because if you were a tout, which was somebody that was an informer, say, to the other side, or had even been nice to somebody on the other side, you were a tout, and you could be murdered or disappeared. So the most famous of these disappeared people is Jean McConville, and look, did I just go out here?
Yeah, wow.
Well, I can talk pretty loud, so I'll just carry on. There we go. Yeah, that was weird. Okay, so basically, where was I? So being labeled a tout, she was labeled a tout for helping a British soldier who, what do you think? Closer. Okay. So she was labeled a tout because she helped a British army soldier who was, thanks, that's going to help. Is it on? Because she was helping a British soldier that had been injured, shot, was in the street. And so she was labeled a tout. She was a mother of 10 children. She was actually a Protestant but living in a Catholic area because she had married a Catholic. So she was already kind of suspect. This family is in the Catholic district, and she had a Protestant husband but she's a widow at this point. She gets carted off one night, and the children are left behind, and the book Say Nothing does document the life of these children and how horrible it was for this one particular family. But this type of thing was happening everywhere. The children thought their mother had left them. They looked for her for years and years and years and years, and her body was not discovered until 2009. And at that point in time, it was clear that she had been disappeared by the Irish unknowns in the IRA. So, Bloody Sunday is another horrible moment in time where there was a mass protest in England. Mass protest in England and assembled in Derry. A huge mass of protesters had assembled in Derry rather, and the British paratroopers fired on the crowd and killed 13 men. And they did not have weapons at that point in time. And 15 other men were wounded. And the riots spread throughout the city, and then things really got out of control. And it was so bad that the British Embassy in Dublin was set on fire. It spread that far. Derry is not exactly next to Dublin. And the march, London suspended the Unionist Parliament because they were saying that now you're totally ineffective and you have no control over the people in the county of Derry. Belfast is actually an Antrim, so Derry and Antrim are right next to each other, and they're both pretty much where the troubles were concentrated. So in Northern Ireland would now be ruled by Westminster. So through all this time, this is a name you're probably familiar with if you recall news from that time. He's a Presbyterian. He's the Presbyterian Church of Ulster. He's a minister, and he preaches a very literal interpretation of the Bible. And he believed that when the European Union situation came along, that was a conspiracy to create Catholic superstate. And he is the leader of the DUP, which is the Democratic Ulster party. And he, ironically, Ian Paisley eventually represents his district at the European Union, and he eventually is elected to be a minister in the new Northern Ireland Parliament, which is called the Northern Ireland Assembly. That's in 1998 when it gets a new name. So the other kind of bad guys in this whole story, sort of bad guys, good guys, I don't know, are Gerry Adams and Brendan Hughes. Gerry Adams is still alive. You might hear about him in the news. He's the leader of Sinn Féin. So Gerry Adams is the leader at this point in time when this photo is taken of the Provisional IRA. And Gerry later leads the political arm of the Provisional IRA, Sinn Féin. And Bill Clinton takes an interest in this whole situation in the 90s and invites Gerry Adams to the United States. And this enrages the British government, as well as many people in his own cabinet. What are you doing inviting this terrorist to meet with you and give him a platform in the White House? And it probably was, believe it or not, a good moment. It worked out and was a catalyst for turning things around. It didn't work out right away, but it did kind of lead to the eventual efforts at peace. So Brendan Hughes is a brigade leader in Belfast, and they are good buddies, and Brendan Hughes follows every directive that Gerry Adams ever gives him, which is basically to kill people and plot terrorist bombings and terrible things, and kind of really admires and looks up to Gerry Adams. Brendan Hughes does. However, Brendan Hughes becomes alarmed as he sees his friend Gerry Adams begin to think that there has to be a political solution, that violence isn't working. Meanwhile, Gerry Adams is teetering on a situation where I've got to keep my people together, but I have to get them all to move to this political idea and away from the violence. You can imagine that was a little bit of a rough road. So Brendan is devastated by this. And by the time Brendan dies in 2008, they are no longer anywhere near being friends or anything like that. And he dies of alcoholism, basically, and he was involved in hunger strikes. They're told that the hunger strikes had taken on his body. So, okay. Basically, going back to the Troubles era, there were London bombings. I think you might be familiar with many of them. Jerry Adams approved all these plans, but he never admitted that he did. Two women, Marion and Dolores Price, who had grown up in families that were very involved in Irish Republican activities ever from 1922 on. That's all they heard at home. They first started off as peaceful demonstrators and then went to the dark side and got involved in the unknowns who were disappearing people. And they were the ones that implemented the bombings in London in 1973, and they then went to prison for it and began a hunger strike. And during this time, Dolores begins to ponder, is violence really working? This is just not getting us anywhere. But however, if you said something like that alive and you remember the IRA, the violence isn't getting us anywhere, you were just going to be disappeared. So there are more bombings that keep going on. Lord Mountbatten, you might remember, was out with his family on a boat, and basically the boat got blown up. And then, I don't know how you say his name, Ari Neves, he was a friend of Margaret Thatcher's in the House of Commons, and he was in car park when a bomb went off and killed him. And throughout this, Margaret Thatcher is having the attitude that these people, what's the matter with them? They want to leave our country and go to another country. That's the way she looked at it, not that their country had been divided. That seemed to totally escape her. And she said, these are criminals, and crime is a crime is a crime, is one of the things she said. She had no intention of ever changing and kept a hard line. Then along comes Bobby Sands. This was quite in the news. There were 10 men in this prison, Longkesh, who decided to go on a hunger strike. And Gary Adams convinces Bobby Sands to run for a parliament seat that has just opened up, thinking that Margaret Thatcher would not allow someone to die of a hunger strike if they were in the British Parliament. Bobby Sands wins the seat, and Margaret Thatcher remains adamant that she's not going to cater to these guys. They're criminals. They've been killing people. You can kind of understand her point of view, but it was just, it didn't get her anywhere. And basically Bobby Sands won, but he died in prison for continuing his hunger strike, and all 10 men eventually died, and they're known as the Belfast 10. So the gamble on Margaret Thatcher's part didn't play off, it failed. And the court of world opinion, again, this particular event, along with the Easter Rising and the potato famine, really riled up the Irish in the United States, I would say. And Americans began to send significant donations to the IRA for them to fight the British, which just only put more gasoline on fire. Didn't get anybody anywhere. Violence generally doesn't solve things. And Reagan declared that the violence had to stop, and the only way to end things was through dialogue, and basically that declared that Americans needed to just plain stop sending money to the IRA, and that all would be well. Well, those were kind of like empty words at the time. The IRA bombings continued. This is just a few of them. You might remember hearing about them in the news. But the Brighton Hotel bombing, Margaret Thatcher is a target for that one. And she's getting a lot of pressure from the rest of the world about doing something. So the Provisional IRA claimed to be responsible for all of these bombings. It's kind of like an echo of what's going on today in the world, where these terrorist organizations quickly let you know, we're the ones that did that. So this New Ireland Forum is planned. But the problem with this New Ireland Forum is that the people with the guns are not invited to this forum to solve all the problems. This is sort of like going to be solving the problems of Ireland, Northern Ireland, the Northern Ireland issue. But none of the people with the guns were there. So the Social Democrat Labour Party is a party of peace and reason. And they came up with these ideas that you could have a united state of Ireland with all 32 counties. You could have joint British union with two Irelands, with everybody having a say. You could have a government that was responsible for administrating all three things. Basically, Margaret Thatcher gave a famous speech at this point in time. She called it out, out, out to all three ideas that they had. And as I said, the people with the guns were not invited, so things didn't change. So even though things didn't change, they came up with this Anglo-Irish Treaty in November of 1985, and the treaty was strongly advocated by Ronald Reagan. This is what he wanted. He wanted some kind of a peace through politics, and he pressured Margaret Thatcher quite a bit during this time. However, the violence continued. It wasn't ending anything. Again, the people with the guns are not being invited, on either side, Protestants or Catholics, are not being invited to negotiations. So Reagan's pleas fall on deaf ears, and Americans are still sending money to the IRA at this point in time. And the military peacekeepers and the mostly Protestant RUC did not change their tactics. That's the police force. So by 1991, you've got all these different parties in Ireland, but the parties that are IRA leaning are minorities. They're getting elected, but they're minorities. So all the decisions are still going the way of Protestants in, Catholics out. Maybe we can get them to move away. That was still the circumstance in 1991. All over Belfast, if you go there, there's still these murals everywhere. Kind of fascinating. This one is, they were created during the Troubles and since, some of them, for every faction that was just on that last slide. And this mural was created by the citizens aligned with the Democratic Ulster Party. That's Ian Paisley's party. This one was created by the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association. Their idea was one man, one vote. That was formed in 1967, as the Troubles were really beginning to heat up. And their main argument was basically the landowners had a vote for their land as well as a vote for being a person. And so it's already Protestant dominated. Catholics just had no hope of having any say in anything that was going on in the civil environment. And this poster, mural rather, was created by the Northern Ireland Women's Coalition. It's like, let's have peace, folks. Let's please have peace. So in 1998, we finally are getting to a point where we can do something here. It's been in agreement, this agreement that they came to had been in the works for 5 years at that point. And there had been a Downing Street declaration by John Major, you may remember him when he was Prime Minister in England. Basically, that was totally everything that finally got put into this 1998 agreement. But it was totally rejected by the DUP, and which is the Unionist Party. And then Sinn Féin said, well, this could work, maybe let us see the details. Well, it never really got rolling. And this is about the time that Clinton is getting involved. And he sends over George Mitchell to try to get peace going. And Bertie A. Hearn is the Taoiseach of the Irish Republic, and he gets involved in the talks. He's a center-right, he's sort of like a moderate, I guess. You would have to call him a moderate, center-right Republican that split off from Sinn Féin back in 1927 after the countries of Northern Ireland was split away from the Republic of Ireland. So Clinton appointed George Mitchell in 1995, and he comes over to get things going. Tony Blair ousts John Major in the election. He's a new guy on the block at this point. He's only been in office a year. And he campaigned on this. And John Major, unfortunately, even though he's the one that wrote the Downing Street Declaration and gave a speech about that, he had to campaign geared to the Unionists because he needed their vote. And he got voted out. Now, I wasn't in England at the time. I don't know exactly, but it seems like catering to the Unionists was maybe not the best thing he could have done at that moment in time. Because people had pretty much had it with this whole business. So they created this peace agreement basically based on the declaration at Downing Street, and constructive ambiguity is the word that's used to describe this all the time. And this is, it means basically that we're going to basically put these things on the table. We're going to form a Northern Ireland Assembly, and the decision to unite Ireland will be put off until everybody can be in agreement, and Catholics and Protestants would be put in place, and in a future vote, the majority had an obligation to implement the decision to remain separate or to unite. So basically, it's kind of like your mother or your father putting you on the couch with your sister that you've been squabbling with for 45 minutes and said, you sit here, you both sit here, and don't you move away until you figure this out. And that's what I say, or you're not having dinner tonight, that kind of thing. And it was almost like that. So the British government basically put out this statement: the power of the sovereign government with jurisdiction there shall be exercised with rigorous impartiality on behalf of people in the diversity of their identities and the traditions, and shall be founded on the principles of full respect for and equality of civil, political, economic, social, and cultural rights and freedom from discrimination for all citizens, and parity of esteem, and justice and equal treatment for identity, ethos, and aspirations of both communities. Something that totally had not been happening, totally not. But they formed the Northern Ireland Assembly, and basically what that, part of that was that there were going to be two ministers that were elected, one from the Unionist side and one from the Republican side, and they were both going to be leaders. One was going to be deputy minister, and one was going to be first minister. First minister is the party with the most votes, and the deputy minister is the party with the second most votes. So basically, and if you can't sit down and meet, all power is going to be reverted to Westminster. And this was basically the moment that set us on the path to the peace agreement, for the peace agreement to work, although it was still rocky for a while. So the British government repealed the Government of Ireland Act from 1920, and they repealed a whole bunch of things that were a result of the two countries being separated. And basically the ministers are going to power share. However, they got all these councils that they're developing with, so that the North and the South are continue communicating with one another. And they have boards and citizens groups that they form to make sure they keep talking to one another. And in East-West, that would be Britain and Ireland, they had other groups that were formed, councils and such, that were going to keep things together, keep communication open through all this process. And decommissioning and normalization was the tricky part. Basically, they had been arguing that everybody needs to put down their weapons and then we'll talk. And that didn't work. So the British government did reduce their role in the armed forces, and the Special Powers Act, where they were torturing people, basically, and putting them in prison, was abandoned. And the Irish government committed a wide-ranging review of all of the offenses that had occurred on both sides. And an independent commission would review the justice system. And the governments would release prisoners serving time for paramilitary activity. And everybody was supposed to put down their weapons. That was the state of affairs. And it didn't really go as quickly as you would hope. There was a cry for human rights. A commission was established. But the Irish were demanding a Northern Ireland Bill of Rights, and it still, to this day, has not been created. So the Assembly, as I said, could only meet if both ministers would sit. So they've had a few disputes along the way where the Assembly has been suspended 6 times. And the power reverts to Westminster whenever this happens. In February 2000, it was due to a lack of progress in disarmament. In 2022, it was Paul Gibbons resigns to protest the Northern Ireland Protocol. Now we've got into Brexit. That was a mess for Northern Ireland. And then in 2022, Sinn Féin reaches a majority, so the DUP refused to nominate a minister. We're not even going to nominate anybody. So you're only going to have one minister and you're not going to be able to meet. And then there was a big scandal in 2002 called Stormont Gate, taking a little phrase from our Watergate thing, Stormont Gate, where information was going back and forth, and the Protestants accused the Republicans, the Unionists rather, accused the Republicans, and somebody was spying in Parliament in the offices, somebody was knowing what was going on in both. Well, it turned out, that was suspended for a long time over the Stormont Gate thing. It turned out that a guy named Dennis, what's his name again? What's his name? Oops, I have it somewhere. Anyway, it was somebody working as an informant for the British Army who had infiltrated the Irish Republican offices. But it was a unionist that just said, something's going on here, fishy, and blaming it on the Republicans. He admitted that he had done this. Oops. Sorry. Oh, Glenn, help me. I think I can fix this, but I'm not sure. Oh, where did it go? It's okay up there. I think I'll just continue from there. We're running out of time. What does that say? Reset. Ah. Okay, basically, that got them back in power in getting the Assembly to meet. And then the next thing that happens along the way is the President Bush gets involved and says, we're going to meet at St. Andrews Golf Course. You might remember this. We're going to meet with Martin McGuinness, who's the Sinn Féin leader, and Ian Paisley. And they have a meeting and they decide that they're going to get back and sit down, and they did until Brexit occurred. And then cruising along, and I have to get my picture. I can't even advance this. I can't advance this. you have Michelle O'Neill. She's the leader of the Sinn Féin party, and things are going pretty well. And her family has long history in the Irish Republican Army. I don't know, it just disappeared. And the deputy minister now, because Sinn Féin has the majority, is having a moment about her name. But anyway, she's also, her father was a gun runner for the Unionist militias. And basically, they're getting along and getting things done. Parliament is arguing pretty well amongst themselves and getting the Northern Ireland Assembly and getting things done. And basically, this is a poem that I was ending with, The Fire of Driftwood, which was written by Henry Wadsworth Longfellow in 1848. And if we could read the secret history of our enemies, we could know in each man sorrow and, the other word that was in there, enough to change all of our hostility. Basically, if we could have empathy and understanding for what was going on in the other person's mind or the other side in the conflict, we would not be having any wars ever. And if you think about it, the only thing that brought this to the table was two sides having a dialogue. Violence only gives you power for a few minutes, and dialogue is the only thing that can solve these issues. And it was really rough to get dialogue going in the environment they were in. And the world was basically saying they can't solve their problems. But I really have hope for them at this point in time. I really do. So I'll open it to questions.
Thank you. Thank you. Any questions? All right, you're going to have to be patient with me running with the mic because we only have one. Hang on.
First of all, thank you. You obviously did a whole lot of research and background. It's really informative. I mean, we kind of lived through the period, but I had no idea what was going on. And the second thing is there's a museum in the lower side of New York called the Tenement Museum, and they have various tenements representing different groups of immigrants, and there is one on Irish immigration, and if you're in New York, it's fascinating. There's one on Jewish immigration, a whole lot of stuff. It's absolutely worth seeing. And thanks again, that was great.
Thank you.
Thank you. A lot of information there. I do want to make some comments. For due diligence, I need to admit that my brother-in-law, after he retired, was the American spokesman for Sinn Féin. So, yeah, there's more than a little bias in here. But one of the things I've noticed about Irish history throughout it is the swings. When I was young, Eamon de Valera was one of the great heroes. And then the movie of Michael Collins came out, and Eamon de Valera is now considered the devil of Era. He's considered an evil figure by a lot of Irish, as well as Irish Americans. I'm a little worried about the Gerry Adams view, because many of you may have seen the Say Nothing, or the film, or read the book. And it is one view of what happened.
Are you referring to Say Nothing?
You Say Nothing. Back in 1995, some of you may know, an Irish-American organization brought Gerry Adams to Orlando. And it was the first time the United States allowed any Sinn Féin leaders to come to the United States, Bill Clinton's initiative. And Gerry Adams was an extraordinary speaker. And one of the things I remember that he said, which I thought was wonderful, was because we did not have the Good Friday peace agreement, there was still a lot of violence going on. And he was asked about the future, what he saw as the future, what type of revenge the Irish should have for 800 years of mistreatment. And he said, what we want as revenge is the laughter of our children. and their ability to play together, which I thought was beautiful. And the one thing I guess I would disagree with you about is, I know that ultimately violence has to end, but if there is violence on one side, occasionally the only way you can deal with it is through violence. I am not sure that a Ukrainian peace movement would have ever convinced Russia just to treat them well, treat them nicely. And after 800 years, you know, it makes some sense for the Irish to, the Catholic Irish, the Republicans, to take arms in the same way that, you know, another country I can think of 250 years ago thought it was necessary to take arms against people who were oppressing it.
Right. I am not disagreeing with you, Saki. Certainly not. It was a miracle, basically, that they got to dialogue. And it was a lot of one step forward, five steps back, three forward, zigzagging all over the place. And it wasn't until they somehow got to that point, which I'd have to consider to be a miracle. The forces that brought that together are amazing to me. And when I talk to people in Ireland that live there now, they're still pinching themselves that this is even working. Nobody thought it could come to be. When we were there in 2008, people were still so skeptical. We had the unfortunate situation where we rented a car without GPS and all the street signs had been taken down. So that people couldn't infiltrate these cities and riot. Those were the locals doing that. They were just disgusted with it and over it, but they couldn't seem to stop it.
Since Britain is no longer in the EU, what's happening with the customs between Ireland and Britain?
Boy, that's a talk all by itself. Basically, the border is open, but it's called they've got an economic unity that allows them to cross the border, but they're a political division. And I can't remember the names of what they called it, but basically the Northern Ireland protocols, after the Brexit mess up, basically, that really almost threw the peace agreement out the window. And the first thing I thought of was the peace agreement. That's down the tubes when I started hearing when the Brexit had passed. So, yeah, you are able to trade. It's not so bad now. They had to come up with they had log jams everywhere with people trying to trade with England, even with red tape at the borders, and they have worked some of this stuff out. It's better.
The trade situation has got nothing to do with the conflict. It's to do with the Brexit.
Yeah.
England and Northern Ireland left the European Union and Southern Ireland didn't. And that meant that there would have to be a border to prevent goods moving. And that was considered to be a very dangerous situation, and therefore they made a compromise that the people living in the north of Ireland would have the benefit of being able to buy goods at European Union prices. So you're in a privileged position now if you live in Northern Ireland. I want to think the credit for the peace goes to first several American presidents, particularly Reagan and Clinton, and to the senator from Maine, Mitchell.
Oh, Mitchell.
Senator Mitchell, who worked for decades, constantly being disappointed, but kept going. I think he worked for 20 years to get that agreement.
Right. That was quite an astute nomination to that position by Clinton.
I think it's as a result of American pressure that we've got it. And by the way, there was a bombing in the last month, there was a bombing in Northern Ireland.
Was there?
Yeah, I don't know what it was about, but there was one. Yeah.
There is still in Northern Ireland a feeling amongst some Protestants, although it's shrinking. Most people would like to end this. It's shrinking, but not fast enough as far as I'm concerned. The people that are willing to resort to violence to solve their issues and not allow the political discourse to somehow occur in Parliament. They just are not happy. And again, I bet you the bombings was in Belfast, because that seems to be a place, a hotbed still. Yes.
One last question, and then we're done, and the question is mine. My wife and I were in Belfast in 2022, and as I told you, we met with a professor of Irish history who readily admitted that his father was one of the murderers. He was a Protestant, and seemed to be very forthcoming in describing the Troubles. He said, and I don't know whether this is true or not, this is my question to you. He said that essentially what led to the peace was the agreement or the understanding between both sides that violence had to end, and the only way that could be done was if each side gave up any claims for revenge. That whatever had happened in the past was closed, and there would be no steps taken, and that they were starting a new page to go forward. Is that essentially correct?
That was what Mitchell was trying to accomplish with the peace agreement. He kind of set the table for that to happen. And I hope that eventually it really will come to total fruition. It's working a little bit now, and we were in Belfast 2 years ago, and peaceful city, but I imagine things are going to be disrupted. If you're there long enough, you're going to see something happen that you don't really care to see. But most of the paramilitary units have decided that they have to just go with this. And the Protestants are in fear that they're going to be outnumbered by the Catholics. And we stayed in a B&B with a man who was friends with one of the Belfast 10. He had gone to elementary school with him. And he had written, there was in the coffee table in the B&B, there was this book about the Belfast 10, and I started reading it. And I saw that he had an entry in there, an obituary type of an entry for his friend. And he said, when I talked to him about it later on, the owner of the B&B, he said, basically, the Protestants are worried that we're going to treat them the way they've been treating us for 800 years. And he says it's a hard thing to get past. But I would say this man, in spite of his involvement and his losing a childhood friend and many others, he said there was no avoiding being involved. It was just all around you.
Thank you very much. Very, very interesting.
So I have a copy of Say Nothing up here, if anybody wants to see that. That's a pretty interesting book. I wound up reading it in less than a day and forgetting about sleeping and eating. And my cousin, who's a therapist in Ireland, who deals with children who've lost their parents, said she's not even able to pick it up. It's still too raw for her. She can't read it. So just to warn